What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to build this simple kids step stool. So the cool thing about it is that I took my niece's artwork and put it on the top step. So it's kind of customized for her. Can't wait to give it to her. And this was a nice simple project, but the artwork on the top step was a cool twist. So let's go ahead and get started. So I built this step stool using scrap pieces of 3/4 inch maple plywood I already had on hand. But you can get all the pieces for this stool from a 2 foot by 4 foot piece of plywood from the home center. So the first step was to cut the pieces to size, and I used the table saw and miter saw for this, but you could also just cut these pieces using a circular saw if that's all you had. After I had all the pieces cut to size, I needed to cut the cutaway for the first step, the taper on the front and back edges of the sides, and the cutaway for the legs. So first I stuck the two sides together using double stick tape, just so I could do all the cutting at once and they'd match up perfectly. So I laid out the cutaways based on the dimensions, which are listed in the build article on my website, and I also have more detailed plans available there with a detailed cut list, a SketchUp file, and a cutting diagram for breaking down the plywood. Once I laid out all the lines, I started cutting them out on the bandsaw. If you don't have a bandsaw, you could definitely use a jigsaw here instead. The first thing I cut was the cutaway for the first step. Next, I cut the tapers on the front and back edges of the sides. This wasn't really a necessity, but it gives the stool kind of a cool modern look. For the leg cutaway, I decided to cut the curves in the corners using a 2-inch Forstner bit, and then just connected these two holes with the bandsaw. This gives the corners a perfect uniform curve, and I also had a thick resaw blade installed on my bandsaw, which doesn't cut curves very well, so this allowed me to avoid having to change my blade. Next, I rounded over all the corners using an oscillating belt sander, and then sanded all the curves using a combination of hand sanding and a random orbit sander. Since this stool is for kids, I wanted to remove all of the sharp corners just so they couldn't hurt themselves. With all the shaping done, I separated the two sides and then rounded over all the edges of the pieces using a 3/8 inch radius roundover bit on my router table. In retrospect, I probably shouldn't have rounded over the edges where the sides met the steps, but this didn't make a huge difference in the end. To assemble the stool, I used a combination of pocket screws and dowel joinery. The support pieces are attached to the bottom of the steps using pocket screws, and the sides are also attached to the steps using pocket screws. I assembled all the pieces using pocket screws and then drilled the holes for the dowels. So I used 3/8 inch oak dowels, since that was what I had on hand, and drilled the holes using a 3/8 inch Forstner bit on the drill press. So it's pretty important that these holes are drilled perpendicular to the sides of the stools, otherwise you might end up kind of blowing out through the sides of one of the pieces. And to help with this, if you don't have a drill press, you can just use a square with your cordless drill, and this helps to keep the holes perpendicular. Once all the holes were drilled, I added glue to the holes, pounded in some dowels, and then cut them flush using a flush cut saw. Once all the dowels were added, I also clamped all the joints together just to pull everything nice and tight. Next, it was time to add the artwork and epoxy to the top step. So I attached my niece's artwork using spray adhesive, and then mixed up a batch of Art Resin epoxy. So I poured on one layer, spread it out, and then decided it needed a little more coverage, so I mixed up another batch. And the cool thing is Art Resin has a 45-minute open time, so you can easily kind of err on the side of mixing too little, so you don't end up wasting any epoxy. If you want to learn more about Art Resin, I'll have a link in the video description below. Once I poured the epoxy on, I used a propane torch to pop the bubbles, and then let the epoxy cure for about 36 hours. Alright, so I want to take a quick second and just talk about some of the issues I ran into when applying the epoxy. The main issue is that the text that was on the back of the artwork bled through, and I don't know why I didn't really think about this, but of course, you know, epoxy is basically like submerging your piece of paper in a liquid. So if you want to do this, I'd recommend having your kids do the artwork on like a piece of construction paper, or they could even actually just do it right on the wood. And that's what this Art Resin is kind of designed for, is to protect artwork like this. So the other issue I had was I attached the artwork with a spray adhesive, and I guess I didn't put enough because some of the corners came up. And this isn't a huge deal, but they actually become kind of sharp because, again, they're kind of impregnated with epoxy. So I was able to kind of trim those down with a chisel, but those are just some of the issues I ran into. Overall, though, Art Resin is really easy to work with, and I'm just amazed at how crystal clear it is. There are no bubbles. I mean, it's just really awesome stuff. Just keep those things in mind. With that said, let's go ahead and get back to the build.
With the top done, I sanded all the pieces up to 220 grit, and then it was time to apply finish. I'm using Waterlux again on this build, and they're also one of the sponsors of this video. So I applied Waterlux this time using a natural bristle brush, and I definitely recommend applying it this way. It's a lot easier to control the amount I was putting on versus using a foam brush like I've done before. And I really love the way it brought out this nice amber color on the maple plywood. I think it looks great and actually matched the epoxy on the top step pretty nicely. If you want to learn more about Waterlux, check out the link in the video description below. I applied 3 coats of Waterlux, allowing it to dry roughly 24 hours between coats. And the last step on the project was to add a few rubber feet to the bottom of the stool just to keep it from slipping around. Once the feet were installed, I added my stamp and the date I made it, and the stool was done.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was a lot of fun. Again, I have plans available on my website if you want to build one of these for yourself. Also, I have links in the video description to all the materials I used. If you don't already, maybe consider getting subscribed. I put out new project videos like this every Tuesday. And last, if you want to support me a little further, see some cool rewards and some behind the scenes content, check me out on Patreon. It's patreon.com/craftedworkshop. All right, thanks again, guys, and until next time, happy building.